everyone. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode in honor or in memory of a loved one, please contact the Matan office or email us at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast. Today's episode is dedicated in memory of Ahuva Volovsky, my husband's grandmother, who passed away just a few hours before recording this episode. My tefillah, my prayer, is that this episode brings comfort to all of those mourning. Each week we spend 30 minutes speaking about a seminal figure or idea on that week's parsha. Parshat Korah opens with the rebellion of Korah and his partners and is followed by vignettes of repair and of further breakdown. The fire pans, the machtot of the rebels, are formed into a covering for the altar to remind the people not to overstep ritual boundaries. The people then respond to Korah's episode by complaining and are met with a fierce divine plague that kills 14,000. This is followed by another complaint, this time framed constructively by the people regarding their fear of collective punishment. God then clarifies that the burden of boundary violations in the tabernacle will be the responsibility of the tribe of Levi, and the entire camp will not suffer. The parsha ends with the laws of tithes, trumot, and masrot. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Erica Brown, a returning podcast guest, and please make sure to check out that earlier episode on the Women Writing Torah series. Dr. Erica Brown is the Vice Provost at Yeshiva University of Values and Leadership and serves as the Director of its Rabbi Laura Jonathan Sachs Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership. Erica, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So of our vast array of characters that we have in this week's Parsha, who would you like to speak about today?
So I thought a lot about this, Yosefa. You know, there's Moshe and Aaron's response to Korach's challenge. There's Korach himself. We don't have much information on him. We can only understand who he is by virtue of what he says and what he does. Then we, of course, have Datan and Aviram. But when I was looking at the character who maybe most speaks to me in this parsha, it's actually the wilderness itself. In other words, the landscape behaves in a very unusual way. In my own study of Bamidbar, I think that the landscape is the persistent sort of force that pushes Bnei Israel back as they're trying to advance forward. And so that's, I really want to focus on character, on landscape as character, if you will. It's a little bit of a different take. So if you're prepared to do something a little bit different with me today, that's where I'd like to go.
I'm with you. I'm jumping right in.
Okay, awesome. So I want to just read the way the landscape behaves, and then maybe we'll tie it into some larger themes in the book of Bamidbar. So when there's this sort of absurd contest that Moshe implores HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do something in this situation where Moshe and Aaron's leadership is challenged, and the idea is we're going to have some competition, and we're going to take these fire shovels, if you like, these fire pans, and we're going to see who comes out strongest. And then as this context is coming to its end, the idea is that the earth swallows everyone. You try to explain this parsha to a child, and it's very, very scary. The idea that you can do something wrong and then the earth swallows you. So I just wanted to read that with everyone. We're in Bamidbar Tet Zayin, Pasuk Lamed. Im bria yavria Hashem ufatzta adama etzbiha uvala'a ota. What's going to happen is God is going to this new thing is going to happen. The earth is going to open up its mouth, right? And you imagine that image of the earth swallowing. All of a sudden, the earth itself has become personified. That's why I think of it as a character. The earth opens its mouth, uvala'a, and swallows people. But kol asher lahem, and everything that they have. V'yardu chayim shoala v'yadatem kinatsu anashim ha'ela et Hashem. right? And the earth, in a way, is going to declare who the winner is. Because once these individuals have been swallowed, then people will know that they ridiculed God's choice. And I think Moshe did something very, very clever in putting the onus on God. It was, instead of Moshe sort of trying to defend the choice of him and Aaron as leaders, he basically says, I didn't make this choice. In fact, if anything, I didn't want this. I asked repeatedly not to have this. So when Moshe falls on his face, he prostrates himself before this company, before Korah had 250 people. He's asking God to take up that space. He bows, and then this contest, this competition is created. And if you lose the competition, you pretty much lose everything. So what strikes me in this parsha is that Moshe says to Korah, you already have a position of leadership, right? Korah had a position as a Kohen. He had a position of leadership. He's going to sacrifice that by having nothing, right? By having nothing. And all of that, the arbiter of all of this is going to be the land itself. Right? That after Moshe spoke all of these words, then the ground just split, and v'tiftach haaretz et piha v'tivla otam. Exactly as Moshe said is what the land did, and not only did it swallow them, but here's a detail that we don't think about: vet batehem vet kol haadam asher lekorach vet kol harachush. So if you thought, well, we got rid of the people, but everything else about them still stands. Everything actually was demolished. Everything was swallowed. And I'm really, it's one of those images when my children were young and they came home with parsha sheets. It was always people sort of falling into sort of like the Grand Canyon, if you like.
Yes.
They're just all dropping, and that's terrifying enough. But this actually gives you an impression. It's almost like a sort of tsunami that swallows the houses, that swallows everything that owned, as if you're instantly erased. And maybe that's the ultimate price you pay for challenging God's leadership, is that you yourself and everything about you gets erased. So your family can't benefit from that house, even if your family is still there. I think that's really scary. And if you look at as the text continues, right, all that they had went down alive into the grave. So the earth becomes a grave. The land and the relationship of human beings to land is as old as Bereshit Aleph, right? We're taken from land. Bereshit Bet, actually, where we're taken from the dust of the land. We're created with the land. We have a relationship with the land, which is initially positive. Then our relationship with the land becomes negative. When we disobey, we eat from a tree we're not supposed to eat from. And then Hashem says, "B'zeit hapecha tochal lechem." Adam, you're not going to have a relationship where the land is going to give you all of its yield. Now you're going to have to work hard, and you're going to have to sweat. And that curse of the land gets increasingly more harsh as humanity develops, to the point where the land will swallow us up in the story of Noach. And the word Aretz appears, I can't remember how many dozen times in that parsha and Parshat Noach, that the land and humans who are supposed to have this loving relationship with the earth now has an adversarial relationship with the earth.
Later on in the parsha, when for the second time the people come and voice a complaint, although it's spoken much better, and their big objection to is the concept of collective punishment, and they come and they complain that it really is something that is scary. And I'm speaking here; it's in the end of Perek Yud Zayin. And they come and they say, we're all, if we keep making these mistakes, eventually we're all just going to die. And then it seems like God comes up with a new plan, and it's a question whether it's a new plan or the plan all along, but this is where it's said or restated. But he says, when it comes to sins regarding overstepping your religious boundaries, the burden's going to fall on the tribe of Levi. It's not going to kill all of you again. And I don't have any answers, or I'm not even sure exactly where I want to take this, but it sort of harkens back to this collective punishment of Korah's family. And life in the wilderness is extremely harsh. And so when a punishment is going to come, it's going to be delivered very, very harshly. And I will say that in the broader movement of Tanakh, we move away from the world of collective punishment. We move away to a world of individual accountability. But this parsha really throws you deep into that world of collective punishment, and you feel how harsh it is, right? You're saying it's not just falling into a hole and sort of having a party underground like it looked in those parsha pictures, but it's just an utter... Again, it's this utter swallowing, and it's people who weren't necessarily guilty in this episode. So this idea of collective punishment sort of hovers over us in a number of ways and a number of echoes in this parsha.
Yeah, I mean, I think this parsha is theologically extremely challenging.
Yeah.
And I think in some way it's easier to avoid altogether, which is exactly why I wanted to talk about it. Because I think you can't avoid it. You mentioned the end of Yud Zayin, but right before Yud Zayin, at the end of Tet Zayin, it says, V'chol Yisrael asher tzivu etehem nasu l'kolam ki amru pen tivalaenu haaretz. In other words, the people around, the people were watching. I mean, what's going on? What's the view from the stadium? And as everybody watches the earth swallow people, all of Israel starts screaming, right? They raise their voices. What if the earth swallows us also? Now, what I'd like to suggest is that this goes back much, much earlier. This notion of the earth swallowing people and acting as a character. So I'm going to take us all the way back to Sefer Shemot, Yud Daled, Pasuk Gimel, where Pharaoh allows Bnei Israel, he allows the Israelites to go into the wilderness because he says they'll go astray in the land, and the wilderness has closed in on them. He understands that the wilderness will have this. I don't have to pursue them. The wilderness itself will do its pursuit. Now, the irony, of course, there is that Pharaoh suffers as a result of that. It was the earth swallows him up, or you could say the water, but in effect, it's the same. It's the forces of nature swallow up Pharaoh. But he, and in fact, we could go back earlier from 14 to 13. 17 and 18 in Sefer Shemot, the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So Kadosh Baruch Hu will lead the people round about by way of the wilderness. I'm going to use the landscape to confuse them. They're not actually going to be able to move forward because they'll have to move in the direction. They'll be so surprised. They'll be so trapped by this wilderness that they'll have to follow a leader. They can't just go at it on their own and try to go back to Egypt. It's just not going to work. And the images in the Midbar we have pretty much everywhere. The Midbar is the place of chaos, and it's a place of uncertainty, and it bewilders, and it swallows. And it's also a place of primitive love, right? It was, I'm alone with God. We're alone with God. So, Lech tech acharai bamidbar, we read in Yirmiyahu, pursue me in the wilderness. That is where we will live together, unencumbered by normal life. And we certainly know that there are religious movements that existed, monasteries and tribes that lived and continue to live in desolate places as a way of letting go of the rest of the world. Now, as it happens, Bamidbar is problematic on a lot of levels because we have actually no recorded births in the book of Bamidbar. That's a fact that the scholar Robert Cohn noted, that there's not one single birth recorded in this entire book. And I wanted to read something that Adrian Levine wrote about this. While Numbers, you should call this book of Bamidbar Numbers, while Numbers narrates the variety of ways in which people die, it only records the burial of members of the generation once, with extreme brevity, and that's in Perek Yud Aleph. The lack of specificity when it comes to the people's location at the end of their lives is especially startling when contrasted to the introduction of that very same generation at the opening of Numbers. We begin Sefer Bamidbar, and we have lots of names. But as the book continues, and we have the earth swallowing people up, and we have wars, and we have magefot, we have plagues, all of these people die and we know nothing about them. Those who were so meticulously accounted for, she writes, each tribe named, numbered, and assigned a specific placement around the tabernacle and the camp, they're now left in their deaths, unburied, unmarked, somewhere in the wilderness. So so death in some way is unmarked. And that's true for Miriam, right? We know that when Miriam dies, we have no idea where she dies. There's something about not being born in the Midbar and just dying in the Midbar. The earth swallows you and erases you. So Korah, if you like, is the most extreme example. But Paro understands that this is going to be the fate of people in the wilderness.
So what you're essentially saying is that Korah is sort of a microcosm for what happens to everybody in this generation, if I understand you correctly.
Not quite everybody. I think the Midbar affects everybody. I think the landscape becomes the source of our complaints, of our thirst, of our hunger, of our sense that this will never end. And we can't always see Gula, we can't always see a redemptive root. I think, though, that it intensifies and amplifies with certain populations, particularly seditious, rebellious populations, who get the full force of that swallowing, as we see in this story. I mean, for people who want notoriety, as Korah did, right? Korah wanted a name. He wanted to have the name. He wanted Moshe's leadership. He challenged Moshe's leadership. Kulanu Kadoshim, we're all holy, as if to suggest, and maybe I'm the holiest of all, and why can't I have this position? The ultimate punishment, Yosefa, for someone who wants notoriety is to disappear and have everything about you disappear into oblivion.
Mm-hmm. If I go back to that point about the wilderness being this incredibly harsh place where if you're successful, you can get through it, but many people are not going to get through it, sort of thinking about it on a theological level, what that means or what that creates or what movement about that is necessary for our formation as a people. To go into a land together, to create a society together is an obvious goal. And so what would be the goal of this incredibly harsh reality, which of course was supposed to last much shorter than it did? But even so, even if it was supposed to be short, what's the purpose of this kind of reality?
Yes. So the way I understand that is just travel with me, if you like, for a few minutes to look at the book of Bamidbar as a whole, which is, I think Bamidbar is one of my favorite books because I think it's a really difficult book to understand and everything breaks down. So if you're interested in leadership, it's fascinating because leadership is most required in climates of greatest uncertainty. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, makes a distinction between clock problems and cloud problems. Right? So clock problems, a clock is relatively easy. You take it apart. It works in a mechanical way. It's very technical. If you have a problem with the clock, you could figure it out. But a cloud problem, and it's intriguing because we've got the Ananei Kavod that accompany us, the clouds of glory that accompany us in the wilderness. A cloud problem is dependent on different aspects of weather, and it's complicated. And you can, you put your hand on it, and your hand goes through it. You can't grasp it. It's something that some people call them swamp problems in leadership. So we enter the Midbar, and for the first 10 prakim, the first 10 chapters, we're a highly organized camp, right? We know we have a census that begins. We have digalim, we have flags. We know who our army is, those who are between the ages of 20 and 60. We know where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, rests in the middle of the camp. We understand who carries that tabernacle when it moves and where everyone is situated. Now, what happens from the beginning, those first 10 chapters, to the absolute breakdown of everything from chapter, I'm going to argue about midpoint and 10, everything dissipates, everything collapses. And it begins, ironically, begins with Moshe's insecurity, and we'll talk about that in a second. Then Miriam and Aaron speak, that's in chapter 10 and 11. Then Miriam and Aaron speak badly about Moshe. It's no wonder that you get to a point where 250 leaders accompany Korah, because that all began internally with this small group, with Moshe himself not sure that he could handle all of the contention, all of the strife of the Midbar. And it mounts, and finally it affects everyone. So, in other words, you're going from Moshe, then Miriam and Aaron. That you've got the 12 representatives of the Shvatim, of the tribes, who go to reconnoiter the land. It's like you're working outward to a greater and greater population of seditiousness. And I think when you say, well, what happened? What broke down? We were all so orderly. Well, I think what happened is we started moving. And you can create a really ordered universe, but as you move ahead in that universe, you realize that it is pushing back at you the entire time. It is challenging you the whole time. There's no escape from the challenge of the Midbar ever. It is there. It is persistent. And in some way, it becomes, to me, the great metaphor for leadership, because in leadership, you're always negotiating uncertainty. And sometimes that uncertainty is persistent, and it's everywhere. I want to use an example, if you don't mind. It's one of the best examples I can bring, I think, in literature that has helped me understand the role of the Midbar and why it was so difficult. And then to get to your larger question of, well, what do we learn from this? I mean, how do we make sense of this? So this is from a novel by Amitav Ghosh that I read many years ago called The Glass Palace. And it's about rubber tree plantations that were planted by the British in Burma before the Second World War. And one of the central characters talks about, wow, look at these orchards. Look at all these farms that you've created here in Burma. And this is what one of the owners says. He says, this is my little empire. I made it. I took it from the jungle and I molded it into what I wanted it to be. Now that it's mine, I take good care of it. There's law, there's order, everything is well run. Looking at it, you'd think that everything here is tame, domesticated, that all the parts have been fitted carefully together. But it's when you try to make the whole machine work that you discover that every bit of it is fighting back. It has nothing to do with me or with rights or with wrongs. I could make this the best run little kingdom in the world, and it would still fight back. It's nature, the nature that made these trees and the nature that made us. So there's a description of entropy, of nature fighting back. And you have a garden, you think, this garden looks wonderful, but it requires constant vigilance because there's weeds and there's growth and there are problems with the temperature and there's insects and there's diseases. So if you imagine, as we're moving forward, everything is pushing us back. And it gets to people, and they say, we can't do this anymore. And I think what's remarkable isn't how many people die, but it's how many people survive and go through this crucible. And maybe you can't actually ever be worthy of a promised land until you can work in an unpromised land, until you can work through the uncertainty and say, I've gotten all of Egypt out of me, which is someone else's land. I need to get to my land. And that's going to take a lot of internal and external navigation.
So that sort of collection of unbelievable descriptions brought up two thoughts on my end. One is that the difference between a family photo and a family's actual life.
Yeah.
Which is, you have, my husband and I have a rule of thumb, which is that no matter how bad the trip was, you take a great picture, okay? But if the family photo is that census, it's the descriptions in the beginning, it's that static representation. And then, of course, there's a daily life, which is far messier. And you just largely hope people remember most of the good stuff. But that sort of was the image that comes up. And, of course, I think it's a powerful image because Am Yisrael ultimately is a family system. They're a national system, really, but at their heart, they're a family system. And the second thing that came up for me is that, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the wilderness, while ultimately we want to get to the promised land, the wilderness and the journey that we take to get through there ultimately will represent the journey that we always are on as a nation. And the parts are always moving. There's really never almost anything that is going to be static. And so we can have those ideals, or those, again, the census, the depiction, the geography, the layout, but ultimately we're constantly a group of people with a tremendous amount of moving parts that we're trying to keep some semblance of order to, but that we're always going to have these different parts, factions that are going to be pulling things apart at certain times more than they're pulling them together.
Yeah, I think as a metaphor, you're always leading in the wilderness, right? That's why I named my book Leadership in the Wilderness. We're always leading in the wilderness. I think we've gone through an experience globally right now that has just showed us whatever control you thought you could exert over your surroundings was a delusion, right? It was ultimately, we're not in control, and sometimes we are really out of control. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the human thing and organize, right? When God creates us out of dust, lavda u'lishamra, you're working, you're vigilant, you've got to build it. At the same time, there's an approach that you have to have theologically to uncertainty, to relinquish human control as much as you exert human control, because you will never be able to control certain things. And the midbar is one of those things that you can't control, but it also makes you. And here's the thing that I think people don't realize. The midbar is a book of transition, and so much of our lives are really spent in the transitional period between places. And that's why, like the 40 years becomes, to me, the great allegory of life is not the room that you land in. It's the prose door. It's the hallways. It's the uncertainty of what's on the other side of the door. You can create the fantasy of what's on the other side of the door, but what you're really spending a lot of time in is the steps. It's the walking and negotiating the uncertainty. Bruce Fowler wrote a book called Life is in the Transitions. Yeah. He's a wonderful storyteller, and he says that people go through in the interviews that he did with, I think, 250 people, he and his research team, that people go through about 5 what he calls life quakes over a lifetime, things that really fundamentally question your assumptions about the world. And they may be good things filled with joy, meeting your partner, falling in love with your job and seeing it as a calling. They can be terrible things like sickness and loss and death and retirement for many people. Right? They're life quakes. And sometimes they're not the things that you expect them to be. But he says that today we go through transitional periods every 18 to 36 months. Right. So that's a lot. That's a lot of movement. How resilient are we? What kind of capacity do we have to negotiate that transition? And I think the book of Bamidbar tells you, sometimes there's no births and sometimes there's no deaths, right? Or no recorded deaths. Sometimes it's just you're in the limbo space of life. And you have to figure out how you're going to do that, because that's the hardest space of all to be in. There's no guidebook there. There's no map. Right.
It's 38 years in the tunnel without seeing anything at the end, basically. It's that space.
Yeah. And that's hard. You want to have a happy ending. It's not always apparent. We did have a happy ending, but we had a lot of loss in order to get there. I think Korah is in some way the centerpiece of the earth swallowing humanity, swallowing this troop. And to show it can get this bad. It can get really this bad. But as we wind down in the book of Bamidbar, we take a little tour, if you like, of the various locations where we've been. Right? We've been in this city and the other city, as the text illuminates our travel blog, right? Or I should say our travel log. We don't know where we're going, but we know where we've been. And in each of those cities, something momentous happened. And I think that is representative, if you will, of traveling through life, where different places and place names sort of trigger all kinds of emotions. And we're inviting us on a collective journey. We talked about collective punishment, but there's also the collective accomplishment and achievement of look where we've traveled. Look how far we've traveled. We've been here and we've been there. And some places have brought horrible memories and some have brought really comforting sense of solace and excitement about the path to come. And I think that's that along with the collective punishment in the book is the collective sense of achievement of where we've come to from where we've gone.
Thank you so much for this conversation. There is just sort of this amazing collection of images. I love images. I love thinking in images that are going to stay with me, and I'm sure many of our listeners after listening to this. So really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for traveling with me today. It's been a gift.
Please make sure to check out the Matan website or call our office to hear more details about Matan's summer program. This year's topic is the Jewish emotional experience with all of your heart and soul. The program dates begin July 3rd to the 21st. You can check out, again, our website or speak to the office to hear more details for this enriching, wonderful summer experience. We will get to meet many of the Matan staff, including myself. We look forward to seeing you there. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.